Hey guys, welcome to BudgetEDH. My name's Mike, and today I bring you Purphoros Bronze Blooded at a $100 budget. Purphoros is 4 and a red for a legendary enchantment creature god with indestructible. As long as your devotion to red is less than 5, Purphoros isn't a creature. Other creatures you control have haste, and you can pay 2 and a red. You may put a red creature card or an artifact creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. Purphoros is basically a sneak attack on an enchantment creature that gives you the ability to put a red or artifact creature card from your hand directly onto the battlefield for 3 mana, but you do have to sacrifice that creature at the beginning of the next end step. In addition, Purphoros also gives all your creatures haste, which works well in an aggro strategy, which is what we are going to play this deck as. This deck has a lot of ways of ramping early on in the game so that we can get Purphoros down as quickly as possible, and then we can use his ability to put some really big creatures onto the board that have a lot of effects when they enter the battlefield. We want a way in this deck where we're able to reuse those creatures that we put onto the battlefield with Purphoros. So there are multiple ways of us doing that. One of them is with extra combat spells, and we do have quite a few of them in this deck that are going to enable us to attack multiple times with the same creature. And then the other way that we're able to do this is we do have some cards in this deck that allow us to either blink our creatures so that way they stay on the battlefield and don't get sacrificed by Purphoros' ability. And we do have ways of making token copies of our creatures as well. In addition, one way that we're able to get some big damage in is by having some spells in our deck that allow us to deal extra damage when creatures enter the battlefield, or to double all of our damage altogether, which we did include in this deck. Let's start out this deck tech by talking about some of the ramp that we include in this deck. Now, we do want to get our Purphoros down as quickly as possible so that we're able to use his ability to get some big creatures onto the board that are going to have a big impact on the game. So first up, we have Soul Ring. It's 1 colorless for an artifact you can tap to add 2 to your mana pool. Then we have Mind Stone and Prismatic Lens, which both cost 2 colorless for artifacts that tap for 1. The only difference here is that Mind Stone, you can pay 1 and tap it and sacrifice it to draw a card. And then Prismatic Lens lets you filter out mana, which really doesn't have an impact in this deck. Next up, we have Felwar Stone. It's 2 colorless for an artifact. Tap to add 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce. Now, since we are playing a monocolor deck, the only reason that this is in the deck is because it comes down on turn 2 untapped and gives us an untapped source of mana. Fire Diamond is 2 colorless for an artifact. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you can add red to your mana pool. And then Star Compass is 2 colorless. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you can add 1 mana to your mana pool of any color that a basic land you control could produce. Next up, we have Cold Steel Heart, 2 colorless for a snow artifact. It enters the battlefield tapped, and as it enters the battlefield, you get to choose a color, and then it says tap to add 1 mana of the chosen color to your mana pool. Iron Mirror is a 2 colorless artifact creature that taps to add a red to your mana pool. And then we have Heart of Ramos, 3 colorless for an artifact. Tap it to add 1 red mana to your mana pool, and then you can sacrifice it to add 1 red mana to your mana pool. One cool thing about this card is you can tap it to add a red mana to your mana pool, and then you can also sacrifice it in the same turn, so you'll be able to get 2 mana off of it in 1 turn if you need to. Next up, we have Unstable Obelisk. It's 3 colorless for an artifact. You can tap to add a colorless to your mana pool, and then you can pay 7 and tap it and sacrifice it, destroy target permanent. One thing that red does have trouble with is destroying certain types of permanents. This is a nice colorless way to deal with any permanent that may give you trouble over the course of the game. And then Heartstone is 3 colorless for an artifact. The cost of each creature ability requiring an activation cost is reduced by 1. This cannot reduce an ability's generic mana cost to less than 1. So while this card isn't ramp, it does reduce the cost of Purphoros' activated ability, making it 2 mana instead of 3 to activate, giving you more of a chance of putting multiple creatures onto the battlefield in the same turn. And then the last ramp card is Treasonous Ogre. It's 3 and a red for a creature with Dethrone, and you can pay 3 life and add 1 red mana to your mana pool. This is a really great card because you can use your life as a resource here and add a bunch of mana to your mana pool at the downside of costing you a little bit of life. Next up, let's talk about all the card draw that we included in this deck. Now, Mono Red does have a problem drawing cards, so most of the card draw is going to have a downside to it, but we did include some of the best card draw that Mono Red has in its arsenal. So first up, we have Faithless Looting. It's 1 red for a sorcery, draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards, and it does have flashbacks, so you can pay 2 and a red, and then you can cast this card from your graveyard, then exile it. Tormenting Voice and Thrill of Possibility both let you discard a card to draw 2 cards. The only difference here is Thrill of Possibility is actually an instant, so it's a little bit better. Then we have Cathartic Reunion. It's 1 and a red for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast Cathartic Reunion, discard 2 cards, and then you can draw 3 cards with it. Next up we have Endless Atlas. It's 2 colorless for an artifact. You can pay 2 and tap it to draw a card, but you can only activate this ability if you control 3 or more lands with the same name. This is a really nice card to include in monocolor decks, as it will allow you to draw a card for just 2 mana and a tap. Sandstone Oracle is 7 colorless for an artifact creature with flying. When it enters the battlefield, choose an opponent. If that player has more cards in hand than you, draw cards equal to the difference. We do want ways in this deck to refill our hand and get some more big creatures into our hand to be able to put onto the battlefield with Purphoros' ability. And this is a really great card to fill your hand up back to 7 if your opponents have a full grip. Next up we have Magus of the Wheel. It's 2 and a red for a creature. You can pay 1 and a red, tap it, sacrifice Magus of the Wheel. Each player discards their hand, then draws 7 cards. You do want to have multiple ways of refilling your hand in this deck. And another great one is Dragon Mage. It's 5 red for a creature with flying. Whenever Dragon Mage deals combat damage to a player, each player discards their hand, then draws 7 cards. So this has the same ability as Magus of the Wheel, but it's going to trigger every time it deals damage to a player. So you can get multiple uses out of this card. Next up, let's talk about some of the interaction that we have in this deck. Now, Mono Red isn't well known for its interaction suite, but there are a couple of permanents that we can deal with in Mono Red fairly easily, and one of them is going to be artifacts. So the first card I want to talk about is By Force. It's X and a red for a sorcery, and you can destroy X target artifacts. This is a really cheap, efficient answer of dealing with your opponent's mana rocks or any other artifacts that they may play and get them off the board cleanly. And then next up we have Abrade. It's 1 and a red for an instant. Choose one. Abrade deals 3 damage to target creature, or you can destroy target artifact. This is a nice modal card that gives you some flexibility if you need to get a creature off the board or if you want to get rid of an artifact. And then next up we have Chaos Warp. It's 2 and a red for an instant. The owner of target permanent shuffles it into their library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield. So this is one of the best removal spells that Red has to offer, as it can deal with any permanent. The only downside here is that sometimes it will trade up into a better card by flipping it off the top of your opponent's library. So that is one thing to be careful of. But if you're getting rid of their best permanent, the downside is probably small that it's going to go to a better one. And then we do have one board wipe in the deck, and it's Chain Reaction. It's 2 red for sorcery. Chain Reaction deals X damage to each creature, where X is the number of creatures on the battlefield. Board wipes are really good in our deck, as we're not going to have a lot of creatures on our board, as we'll be putting them in with Purphoros, and we do have a couple of creatures in the deck too that will enter the battlefield and deal some damage to the other creatures on the board too, giving us some more board wipe options in this deck. Next up, let's talk about all the creatures that we want to put onto the battlefield with Purphoros' ability. Now, a lot of these creatures are going to have a high converted mana cost because we can cheat those creatures onto the battlefield with Purphoros' ability, and we do have a lot of ways in our deck to keep those creatures around. And a lot of creatures that we decide to go with in this deck give us some additional value either when they enter the battlefield or when they die, which is great because unless we have one of our ways of keeping those creatures around, we do want to get as much value out of them as possible. So first up, we have Rapacious Dragon. It's 4 and a red for a creature with flying. When it enters the battlefield, create 2 treasure tokens. This is going to give you a little bit of value when it enters the battlefield and give you a couple of treasure tokens. Next up, we have Ryusei the Falling Star. It's 5 and a red for a legendary creature with flying. When it dies, it deals 5 damage to each creature without flying. So this is basically a board wipe on a stick. You can swing it with this, and then at end of turn, it's going to be sacrificed and deal 5 damage to each other creature on the battlefield, which is really great. Steel Hellkite is 6 colorless for an artifact creature with flying. It has pay 2. Steel Hellkite gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and then you can pay X, destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost X, whose controller was dealt combat damage by Steel Hellkite this turn. Activate this ability only once each turn. This card can be very devastating if it deals damage to one of your opponents. You can choose which converted mana cost of their permanents that you want to destroy with this, making an incredibly strong board wipe on a creature. Next up, we have Inferno Titan. It's 4 red for a creature. You can pay red. Inferno Titan gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, it deals 3 damage divided as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 targets. If you put this in with Purphoros, you'll get a 3 damage trigger, and then when you attack with it, you'll also get a 3 damage trigger, dealing 6 additional damage to any target that you choose. Hoarding Dragon is 3 red for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an artifact card, exile it, then shuffle your library. When it dies, you may put the exiled card into owner's hand. We do have a lot of artifacts in this deck since we are playing mono red. This can find you any artifact when it enters the battlefield, and then it's going to die at the end of the turn if we use Purphoros, and you'll get that card right into your hand, which is really great. One of the cards that you can find with Hoarding Dragon is another great creature, and it's Combustible Gearhulk. It's 4 red for an artifact creature with first strike. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent may have you draw 3 cards. If the player doesn't, put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard, then Combustible Gearhulk deals damage to that player equal to the total converted mana cost of those cards. We have a ton of cards in our deck that have a high converted mana cost. If your opponents don't want to let you draw 3 cards, they do have a chance of getting hit for quite a lot of damage with this card. Next up, we have Burning Sun's Avatar. It's 3 red for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to target opponent and 3 damage to up to 1 target creature. This is a great 6/6 beater that's going to deal an additional 6 damage when it enters the battlefield, 3 to an opponent and 3 to a creature, making this a really great rate on a creature. Spawn of Thraxus is 5 red for a creature with flying. When it enters the battlefield, it deals damage to target creature or player equal to the number of mountains you control. This card can deal a ton of damage in this deck since we are playing mono red, and you can put this in for just 3 mana, making this a really great card to include. Tyrant's Familiar is 5 red for a creature with flying and haste, and it has Lieutenant. As long as you control your commander, Tyrant's Familiar gets +2/+2 and has, whenever Tyrant's Familiar attacks, deals 7 damage to target creature defending player controls. This will come down as a 7/7 and clear any blocker that gets in the way of it. Next up, we have Molten Primordial. It's 5 red for a creature with haste. When it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, gain control of up to 1 target creature that player controls until end of turn. Untap those creatures, they gain haste until end of turn. So with this card, when it enters the battlefield, you can take a creature from each of your opponents, and then you get to use those creatures until end of turn, swinging into your opponents with them. If you have a sacrifice outlet too, you can actually sack those creatures after you attack with them. You can really devastate your opponents that way. Next up, we have Meteor Golem. It's 7 colorless for an artifact creature. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-land permanent and opponent controls. In this mono red deck, we do have trouble getting rid of certain types of permanents, and Meteor Golem is going to let us cleanly answer any permanent for 3 mana with Purphoros on the battlefield, plus we can swing in with it too and get some additional damage. Chaos Maw is 5 red for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to each other creature. We want to have ways of dealing with our opponent's board in this deck, and Chaos Maw gives us an additional board wipe on a creature for just 3 mana, and it also comes with a 6/6 body, which is really great too. Next up, we have Dracuseth, Maw of Flames. It's 4 red for a legendary creature with flying. Whenever it attacks, it deals 4 damage to any target and 3 damage to each of up to 2 other targets. This is a card that's going to deal a ton of damage if you put this into play with Purphoros. Not only is this a 7/7 body, but it's also going to deal 10 damage split to up to 3 different targets, which is extremely strong at that rate. Next up, we have Utvara Hellkite. It's 6 red for a creature with flying. Whenever a dragon you control attacks, create a 6/6 red dragon creature token with flying. We do have quite a few dragons in this deck because mono red's big creatures typically are dragons. So if you have a way of getting this creature to stick around onto the battlefield, you can make quite a few dragons off of this. One thing to note with this card is it will make dragons with your tokens if your tokens attack. It does not say non-token dragon attacks, which makes this card even better. And then the last card I want to talk about is Avatar of Slaughter. It's 6 red for a creature. All creatures have double strike and attack each turn if able. This is an 8/8 body that's going to have double strike, so this is going to swing in for 16 when you put it onto the battlefield. And if you have a way of getting this to stick around, it's going to make all of your opponent's creatures attack, which can be really good if you have opponents that don't want to attack in with their creatures, especially since we have a lot of big threats that can block those creatures fairly easily. So since we can put any creature from our deck onto the battlefield for just 3 mana with Purphoros on the battlefield, we do want some ways in this deck that we're able to take advantage of that and get those creatures to stick around or make additional copies of those creatures. That way we can get some additional uses out of them. First, we're going to talk about some ways that we're able to copy those creatures and get some additional copies of those creatures we put onto the battlefield. So first up, we have Flame Shadow Conjuring. It's 3 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay red. If you do, put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of that creature. That token gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of the next end step. So this is going to let you make a copy of any creature that you may put in with Purphoros for only 1 red mana. The only downside is that that token goes away at the end of the turn, but you'll be able to swing in with 2 of those creatures that you put in with Purphoros, which makes this card really strong. Next up we have Mirror March. It's 5 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, flip a coin until you lose a flip. For each flip you won, create a token that's a copy of that creature. Those tokens gain haste. Exile them at the beginning of the next end step. This is another card that's going to give you a way to add additional copies onto the board of those creatures that you put in with Purphoros. The only downside here is that you do have to win those coin flips, so on average you will only make a token 50% of the time, but there is times where you'll make quite a few copies off of this card, making it a really good card to include, especially for its casting cost. Next up we have Mirage Mirror. It's 3 colorless for an artifact. You can pay 2 and then Mirage Mirror becomes a copy of target artifact, creature, enchantment, or land until end of turn. This is another great way of making copies of any creature that you put on the battlefield, and you can use this to make copies of your opponent's permanents as well, making this a really great card in this deck. Next up we're going to talk about a few more ways that we're able to get our creatures to stick around after putting them onto the battlefield with Purphoros. So first up I want to talk about Sundial of the Infinite. It's 2 colorless for an artifact, and you can pay 1 and tap it to end the turn. Activate this ability only during your turn. And then to end the turn means to exile all spells and abilities on the stack, discard down to your maximum hand size, damage wears off in this turn and until end of turn effects end. So what you can do is with the Purphoros trigger on the stack to sacrifice your creatures, you can actually use your Sundial of the Infinite and end the turn right then and there, and then those creatures will actually stay on the battlefield. They will not be sacrificed. This is one of the easiest ways to get your creatures to stick around in this Purphoros deck. Next up we have Cauldron of Souls. It's 5 colorless for an artifact. You can tap it, choose any number of target creatures. Each of those creatures gains persist until end of turn. Whenever that creature dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. When the Purphoros trigger goes on the stack, you can use your Cauldron of Souls to give all your creatures persist, and then they will be sacrificed and then returned to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter, and you'll be able to keep them for the rest of the game. And then Conjurer's Closet is 5 colorless for an artifact. At the beginning of your end step, you may exile target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. Again, this is a nice way of getting your creatures to stick around on the battlefield because you will be able to stack these triggers, the Purphoros Sacrifice and the Conjurer's Closet, where the Conjurer's Closet will go off first and exile your creature before Purphoros makes you sacrifice it, leaving your creature on the battlefield. Next up we have Quicksilver Amulet. It's 4 colorless for an artifact, and you can pay 4 and tap it, choose a creature card in your hand, and put that creature into play. This is a nice card to have in your deck. If something happens to your Purphoros to where you're not able to activate him, you can use Quicksilver Amulet to put all your big creatures into play for just 4 mana. The good thing about this is it actually lets you keep those creatures and they don't die at the end of the turn like with Purphoros. Next up we have Mimic Vat. It's 3 colorless for an artifact and it has imprint. Whenever a non-token creature dies, you may exile that card. If you do, return each other card exiled with Mimic Vat to its owner's graveyard. And then you can pay 3 and tap it, create a token that's a copy of a card exiled with Mimic Vat. It gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of the next end step. This is a nice card in this deck. As your creatures die with Purphoros, you can actually imprint them onto the Mimic Vat and then use them again the next turn. Another great thing about this card is it does work with any non-token creature dying, not just your creatures. So if your opponents have a really nice creature that dies, you can actually imprint it onto the Mimic Vat and then make copies of those creatures as well. And then Feldon of the Third Path is 1 red for a legendary creature. You can pay 2 and a red and tap it. Create a token that's a copy of target creature card in your graveyard, except that it's an artifact in addition to its other types. It gains haste. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. This is the same thing that Purphoros does, except it can only be used for creatures that are in your graveyard. And the really nice thing about this card is it doesn't make you exile the creature to make the copy, so you can keep doing this over and over again, as you will have creatures in your graveyard that you have sacrificed to Purphoros over the course of the game. Another great way with Purphoros to get some extra damage in is by taking extra combats. So next up, we're going to talk about a few cards that give us the ability to take extra combat steps and keep our creatures on the battlefield to get some more damage in. So the first card I want to talk about is Relentless Assault. It's It's 2 red for a sorcery. Untap all creatures that attack this turn. After this main phase, there's an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. So this is going to let you attack, and then you play Relentless Assault, and it's going to let you untap those creatures and attack again, letting you get in for some extra damage with those creatures that you put in with Purphoros. And then we have World at War. It's 3 red for sorcery, and it has the same text as Relentless Assault, but the cool thing about this card is it does have Rebound, which is if you cast a spell from your hand, exile it as it resolves. At the beginning of your next upkeep, you may cast this card from exile without paying its mana cost. So for 1 mana more than Relentless Assault, you're actually going to be able to cast this spell twice because you get that Rebound ability, making this card really great. So next up we have Fury of the Horde. It's 5 red for sorcery. You may exile 2 red cards from your hand rather than pay Fury of the Horde's mana cost. And then it has the same text as Relentless Assault and World at War in that it'll give you an extra combat phase. The great thing about this card is you can exile 2 red cards and play this card for free. Next up, we have a couple of creatures that give us the same ability and let us take additional combat steps. And the first one is Combat Celebrant. It's 2 and a red for a creature. If Combat Celebrant hasn't been exerted this turn, you may exert it as it attacks. When you do, untap all other creatures you control, and after this phase, there is an additional combat phase. And the thing with exert is that your creature will not untap on your next untap step. And then we have Hellkite Charger. It's 4 red for a creature with flying and haste. Whenever it attacks, you may pay 5 red. If you do, untap all attacking creatures, and after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. Both of these creatures are really great as they give you an additional combat on a body, making them a good card to put in with Purphoros' ability. Next up, we have a couple of cards that are going to give us the ability to deal some extra damage when our creatures enter the battlefield, which is great with Purphoros because at the end of that turn, we are going to lose those creatures. Unless we have one of those cards that lets our creature stick around, this is a great way to get some additional damage off of those creatures. So first up, we have Pandemonium. It's 3 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, that creature's controller may have it deal damage equal to its power to target creature or player of his or her choice. One thing to note with this card is it does work for your opponent's creatures as well, so you do have to be careful with this card, but our deck is set up in a way to take advantage of it more than our opponent's decks will. Next up, we have Where Ancients Tread. It's 4 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a creature with power 5 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you may have Where Ancients Tread deal 5 damage to target creature or player. Then we have Warstorm Surge. It's 5 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. These are all really great ways of dealing some additional damage as our creatures enter the battlefield and give us a little bit more reach. And these are all nice because they can also deal damage to creatures. So if there's something problematic on the board, these will actually act as a removal spell as well. Next up, we have Stalking Vengeance. It's 5 red for a creature with haste. Whenever another creature you control dies, it deals damage equal to its power to target player. If you have this on the battlefield with one of those other cards that we just talked about, not only will your creature deal damage when it enters the battlefield and attacks, it will also deal damage when it dies as well, making this card really great. You can get a lot of damage in if you have these cards in the battlefield. And then the last card I want to talk about is Angrath's Marauders. It's 5 red for a creature. If a source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. This card is a one-sided Furnace of Wrath, and it gives all of your stuff double damage, and you can close out a game extremely quickly with this on the battlefield. It's definitely worth including in the deck to get some additional damage in. Next up, we have a couple of cards that are going to give us some card advantage that we desperately need playing a mono red deck. And the first card I want to talk about is Outpost Siege. It's 3 and a red for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, choose Khans or Dragons. If you choose Khans, at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. And then if you choose Dragons, whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, Outpost Siege deals 1 damage to target creature or player. We are almost always going to choose Khans. I don't really see a reason in this deck to choose Dragons. The main reason why we want to play this card is so we can get some additional card advantage off of it by being able to play the top card of our library each turn, since red is so bad at drawing cards. And the next card I want to talk about is Etali Primal Storm. It's 4 red for a legendary creature. Whenever Etali Primal Storm attacks, exile the top card of each player's library. You may then cast any number of non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. Atali is a very strong commander in his own right. We did brew a commander deck tech with Atali. If you want to check it out, I'll put a link in the top right corner. It can make the game interesting because you can get some cards that you would otherwise not be able to in a mono red shell and be able to play those cards and get some interesting interactions with your commander. You can put this in with Purphoros for only 3 and then swing in and get a bunch of stuff off the top of your opponent's libraries. And the really cool thing about this is it doesn't cost you any mana to cast your opponent's spells, which is just insane in this deck. Next up, let's talk about an archetype of aggression. It's 1 red for an enchantment creature that gives creatures you control trample, and creatures your opponents control lose trample and can't have or gain trample. This is a really nice card to ensure that you're able to get your damage in even if your opponents block your big creatures. Next up, we have Ilharg the Razeboar. It's 3 red for a legendary creature with trample. Whenever Ilharg the Razeboar attacks, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. Return that creature to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. When Ilharg the Razeboar dies or is put into exile from the graveyard, you may put it into its owner's library third from the top. If something happens to your Purphoros or you're not able to activate him, we do want ways in this deck that we're able to get those big creatures out of our hands, and Ilharg gives us another way of doing that in this deck. Next up, let's talk about the mana base that we included in this deck. So first up, we have Castle Imbrith. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a mountain, and you can tap it to add a red to your mana pool, or you can pay 1 red, tap it, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. And then we have Spinerock Knoll. It's a land with Hideaway. This land enters the battlefield tapped. When it does, look at the top 4 cards of your library, exile 1 face down, then put the rest on the bottom of your library. You can tap it to add a red to your mana pool, or you can pay red and tap it. You may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost if an opponent was dealt 7 or more damage this turn. This deck is going to have some explosive turns where it's easily able to deal more than 7 damage, so you will be able to get to play whatever card you put underneath this for free. And then we have Rogue's Passage. Tap it to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay 4 and tap it. Target creature can't be blocked this turn. This is a nice way of making sure that your big creatures get in unblocked. And then we have 3 cycling lands, which we put in this deck. If you get flooded on lands, you can discard these cards to draw a different card with them. And then last but not least, we do have 28 mountains in this deck, rounding out the mana base to 34 lands. Next up, I want to talk about a few non-budget cards that you can add to this deck to increase its power level. So first up, we have Balefire Dragon. It's 5 red for a creature with flying. Whenever Balefire Dragon deals combat damage to a player, it deals that much damage to each creature that player controls. This is another great beater that you can put onto the battlefield with Purphoros' ability, and whenever it deals combat damage it's going to deal 6 damage to that opponent's creatures, making it a pseudo board wipe in our deck and a really great inclusion. Next up, we have one of the best creatures that you can put onto the battlefield with Purphoros and potentially knock out an opponent in one swing, and that's Blightsteel Colossus. It's 12 colorless for an artifact creature with trample and infect. Blightsteel Colossus is indestructible, and if it would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, reveal Blightsteel Colossus and shuffle it into its owner's library instead. If you put this onto the battlefield and swing in with it, if your opponents don't have at least 2 toughness of blockers, they will lose the game if this card connects. Next up, I want to talk about a card that I've been putting in most of my non-budget red decks that I play personally, and it's Dockside Extortionist. It's 1 and a red for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, create X treasure tokens, where X is the number of artifacts and enchantments your opponents control. Since there's so many mana rocks and other artifacts that your opponents may have on the battlefield, more often than not, when you play this card, you're going to get a minimum of 3 to 5 treasures, and sometimes you may get even more than that, making this card definitely worth its cost and its price to give you some ramp early in the game and accelerate you out into some of your bigger threats. Next up, we have a 2-card combo that works really well in mono red decks and is a popular mono red deck in its own right. And it's Godo, Bandit Warlord, and Helm of the Host. Godo is 5 and a red for a legendary creature, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an equipment card and put it onto the battlefield. If you do, shuffle your library. And then whenever Godo attacks for the first time each turn, untap it and all samurai you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. And then Helm of the Host is 4 colorless for a legendary artifact. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a token that's a copy of equipped creature, except the token isn't legendary if equipped creature is legendary. That token gains haste, and you can equip it for 5. The great thing about this combo is you can play Godo, find your Helm of the Host, and equip it onto the Godo right away. So the combo with Godo and Helm of the Host is that when you have Godo equipped with Helm of the Host and you go to attack with it, it's going to create a token of Godo. And then after that combat step, it's going to untap Godo, and then you can swing in with the Helm of the Host token and make another Godo, and then it's going to untap your Godos again. And then this is going to be an infinite loop where you can keep creating a untapped Godo and keep attacking with it, making a copy with it each time. And then you end up with infinite Godos and infinite damage to your opponents. Next up, we have another mono red infinite combo, and it involves Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker and Zealous Conscripts. Kiki-Jiki is 2 red for a legendary creature with haste. You can tap it to create a token that's a copy of target non-legendary creature you control. That token has haste. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. And then Zealous Conscripts is 4 and a red for a creature with haste. When it enters the battlefield, gain control of target permanent until end of turn. Untap that permanent, it gains haste until end of turn. So the way this works is you have Kiki-Jiki on the battlefield, and then you play your Zealous Conscripts, and you can gain control of one of your opponent's creatures with it. And then what you can do is you can actually tap your Kiki-Jiki and make a copy of Zealous Conscripts, which is going to enter the battlefield, and you can gain control of Kiki-Jiki and untap it. And then you just keep doing this, and what ends up happening is you'll have infinite Zealous Conscripts on the battlefield that you can attack your opponents with and win the game. Next up, we have an older card that gives us a way of keeping our creatures on the battlefield, and it's Lifeline. It's 5 colorless for an artifact. Whenever a creature is put into a graveyard and a creature is in play, return that creature from your graveyard to play at end of turn. One thing to note with this card is it does work for your opponent's creatures as well. So if this is on the battlefield and your opponent's creatures die, it will bring them back at end of turn as well. This is a really great card with Purphoros, as you can put your big creatures onto the battlefield, and then at end of turn they'll be sacrificed and die, and then Lifeline will bring them right back onto the battlefield, and then they get to stick around for good, which is a really great way of cheating those creatures onto the battlefield for very minimal mana. Next up, we have a land that goes great in mono-color decks, and it's Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. It's a legendary land that you can tap to add 1 colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 and tap it and choose a color. Add to your mana pool an amount of mana of that color equal to your devotion to that color. If you have a bunch of red symbols on the battlefield, Nykthos is going to add mana equal to those red symbols, and this is a great card in monocolor decks as it can add a ton of mana for just 2 colorless to activate it. This card has gone up in price quite a bit since it was announced that we were returning to Theros, because Devotion is back in that set. Next up, we have another way of putting creatures onto the battlefield, and it's Sneak Attack. It's 3 and a red for an enchantment. Pay a red mana, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. That creature gains haste. Sacrifice that creature at the beginning of the next end step. This is exactly like your commander's ability, except it only costs 1 red mana. This gives you another way of using that ability. If something happens to your commander and you're not able to use it, Sneak Attack gives you another way of utilizing that ability to put those big creatures onto the battlefield. And then the last card I want to talk about is Wormcoil Engine. It's 6 colorless for an artifact creature that has Death Touch and Lifelink. When it dies, create a 3/3 colorless worm artifact creature token with Death Touch and a 3/3 colorless worm artifact creature token with Lifelink. You can put this card onto the battlefield with Purphoros' ability, and then when it dies, you do get 2 creatures out of it, making this a really great card to put onto the battlefield, as you will get some additional value when it dies. I want to take a moment to say thank you to all my patrons and all my supporters. I couldn't make these videos without you guys, and I really appreciate it. If you guys are interested in becoming a patron, check us out on patreon.com/BudgetEDH. There's a lot of different rewards and tiers over on Patreon, and we do giveaways pretty frequently over there, and we would love to have some more support for our channel to keep things going. Thank you guys so much for watching this video today. Let us know in the comments down below what you thought of the deck. If there's any cards that you would include that maybe we missed, we'd love to hear from you guys. And let us know if there's any decks that you want to see in upcoming videos. We're always looking for new ideas on decks and content to make. We'll see you guys next time.